Hello everyone, DM Gashbad here. Today we are starting a brand new game. At the beginning of the year I made a resolution that I was going to play 3 new games in this coming year. Games that I had never played before, and this is going to be the first of them. You may have heard me mention this from time to time as a project that's just been running in the background for a while, Rangers of Shadowdeep. Rangers of Shadowdeep is a solo or co-op scenario-based skirmish game. I'm going to be playing this solo. Part of the reason this took so long for me to get out is because I didn't want to start this and then have to stop while I painted more models and terrain. So what I've been doing between other projects is I have been acquiring all the terrain and models that I need to run through the first mission. So if nothing else, I'll be able to complete that. Now, of course, after the first mission, which is 2 scenarios, I'll probably have to take a big break while I set up everything for the next mission, but what can you do? I'm a slow painter. For this first video, I'm just going to go over my Warband creation, my ranger and his companions, because there's actually a fair amount to it. It would be easier for me to do it all in one space here than putting it in the beginning of the first scenario, and this way I also get to talk about the modeling and all that kind of stuff. So here's a picture of my team, and I'll go over some just general principles to begin with. First of all, I'm using Warhammer Fantasy models. I've got a large Warhammer Fantasy army. I'm going to pull from that. I'd like to add to that as well. Second of all, I've watched quite a few videos on playthroughs of Rangers of Shadowdeep, so there's no spoilers or surprises for me. I basically know what's going to happen. Some people like to play through this and be surprised by stuff that happens. I think that's a little strange because you do have to have the models to be able to accommodate some of this stuff. But if you happen to be one of those people, then you shouldn't be watching these, I suppose. Because I generally knew what was going to take place, I had some ideas about how I wanted my gang set up. I knew that in a lot of these scenarios, time is a factor. You've got these clue markers, these objectives to get to. You've got ground to cover, and so I thought a small elite band would struggle for a lot of that stuff. So I tried to, as much as possible, get a fair amount of numbers in my warband. It also helps with the dice being very swingy. It uses opposed dice rolls using d20s. So it's going to be really hard to guarantee any kind of result for stuff. So again, you might as well go with numbers in order to give yourself a little coverage. Finally, I knew that as you progress through these missions and through these scenarios, you're going to be encountering a lot of different types of situations. So I wanted a group with a lot of different skills and abilities that would allow me to not be handicapped when I got to some of these weirder situations. So with all that out of the way, let's take a look at my troops. Now, some of these models you may have seen before in other games. For example, here's my Swordsman getting eaten by ghouls. Here is my Templar and my Man-at-Arms. My Templar is about to fail a leadership test and run away from a bunch of zombies. My Man-at-Arms is also somewhere in the Swordsman unit about to get crushed to death by this Soul Grinder. Here's my Man-at-Arms sensibly running away from a Chimera. Here's my Rogue and Swordsman getting killed by skeleton chariots. And finally, we can see in this scene my ranger as part of a group of huntsmen being killed by a big horde of demonettes. It's possible I should have chosen some models with a better service record. But let's start with that ranger I was just talking about. I didn't make this guy specifically for Rangers of Shadowdeep. I actually made this guy to be the captain of an Averlander Mordheim gang. He is also the champion in my huntsman unit in my Empire army. The Averlanders are known for being scouts and rangers and that kind of thing, and also for having very fancy clothes. So I didn't really go the full Averlander route with the giant floppy hat and everything, but I gave him some elements of that. So he's got a very nice uniform, he's got a big hat with an impressive feather, and I gave him a pipe, because I think that's just a classy thing for a ranger to be out doing. Makes him seem very unflappable in the face of danger. He is built from a series of Empire kits. His body is the champion model from the Empire Swordsman or Handgunner unit from the 6th edition Warhammer Fantasy starter box. His arms are from the Empire Militia / Mordheim Human Mercenary kit. His head is also from the 6th edition unit champion, and he's got a cloak from the Middenheimer sprue. The pipe came from, I believe, the old plastic dwarf kit. As the ranger, he's my most powerful character, he's got the most skills and abilities, but he's not really the most impressive model I've got in the group. Still, I'm reasonably happy with him, it has a fair amount of character, and it does set the tone for the warband. The concept behind this warband is that this is a ranger who very early on in his career lucked into a great big score and got to essentially retire. He defeated some great monster, whether through luck or skill, and then he accumulated all this treasure and then basically went back to town and partied for the next, 5 to 10 years. His early success allowed him to leverage himself into a position as a trainer or some other cushy gig in town, and he's been drinking and partying and just kind of living the high life while everyone else has been crawling around in the mud. So that's why the fancy clothes and the pipe and some of the niceties of civilization that this guy is running around with. In town, he got to study, read, learn new things, as well as hang out with a bunch of more urban individuals that he is going to draw with him on this quest. You see, now that the Shadowdeep has shown up, now all these people who thought that they were safe and in really nice jobs, they all have been recalled to the front line, and so now this guy has to work for a living again. But he's called in some favors with some of his drinking buddies and people that he just pals around with, and so that's the concept behind the group. His name is Tyrus Halperdirk. When trying to think of names, I kept coming back to villain names, and so this guy is based loosely on the two main villains of The Princess Bride, Prince Humperdinck and Tyrone Rugen. I think that's kind of appropriate because rangers are kind of hunters, as Prince Humperdinck is. And so I kind of think of these guys as being the alternate dimension versions of some of these big villains. Their heroic counterparts or variants in the different dimensions. As for his actual stats and abilities, you get 10 build points when you're making your ranger, and you can spend 3 of those increasing your stats, and I see no reason not to. These are the numbers that are going to come into play the most, and anything I spend here I'm probably going to get the most use out of. So, I am going to increase my move, my fight, and my shoot each by 1. You can only increase them by 1. Those are all pretty self-explanatory. Again, this is a scenario, objective-driven, so movement is going to be important, and I want this guy to be able to fight, so might as well increase those 2 stats, and we're off and moving. Next we come to heroic abilities and spells. Now these are basically once per scenario skills that you can use. I personally am not a big fan of single-use items and abilities. Whether it's miniature games, video games, role-playing games, I'd rather have things that affect my character throughout. I don't like having things that are just fire once and then you're done. It's just not the way I like playing the game. I tend to be stingy with the stuff. I tend to hold on to it too long. But I did go for 2 of these. Number 1, I went for Hand of Fate. It's a heroic ability, and remember how I said the dice are really swingy? Well, this allows me to do a reroll. So if I get burned by a really bad roll on my ranger, I can reroll his dice. I really don't want this guy getting taken out. He is my most valuable model. And so to complement that, I also gave him the spell Heal. He was hanging out with some magicians in the city and picked up some magical stuff. Number 1, heal just sounds useful. If I'm not currently fighting anyone, I can make my guys a little healthier. Number 2, if your ranger has a spell, any spell, then he also gets a piece of magical equipment. So while I might not see the value in having a whole bunch of spells, having one spell is more powerful than it might normally be on its own. That magical equipment, by the way, that I'm going to take a spell book. So if I don't cast that spell in the course of the game, I get to save it, and I can cast it in another game. That means if I'm having an easy time in one of these scenarios, I can bank that heal spell, so if I'm having a more difficult time in one of the later ones, I can cast heal twice, if I need to. So that's 5 build points spent. We now come to skills. Skills give modifiers to various tests that you'll have to take during the game. While occasionally these can be really important, there's no real telling which character is going to have to be called on. And even if you have a modifier in the required skill, you're still rolling a d20, so a +1, +2 might not really make that much of a difference. So I only spent 2 build points on that, but each build point allows me to increase up to 8 skills by 1. So in the end, I went for acrobatics, ancient lore, leadership, tracking, perception, read runes, survival, and swim, all at +2. The reason I chose a lot of these skills was because I didn't want to double up on a skill that some of my companions already had. Also, I think it represents a fairly good spread of skills that a guy who spent a lot of time both in town and out in the wilderness might acquire. Some skills to note on this: swim is going to be very valuable at a certain point later on in another mission, and leadership. Any points you have in leadership adds directly to the recruitment points that you can field. Now, the thing about that, though, is that everything that you might recruit comes in increments of 5. So leadership of +2 doesn't really get me anything. It is an investment in the future. If I keep advancing this skill at +5, I'll be able to recruit something like a bloodhound, or exchange one of my lower cost companions with a higher cost one. Maybe they get, advanced or promoted or something like that. And again, I think bodies on the field are pretty important. I'd rather have those than more heroic abilities or spells, for example. Speaking of that, the next thing we can spend build points on is recruitment points. I can spend up to 3 build points to get +10 recruitment points, so I spend the maximum of 3, and so now instead of having 100 recruitment points, I have 130. Tyrus is a charismatic guy, or maybe people just owe him a lot of favors. Finally, we have equipment. I've already mentioned my magical equipment. I got a spell book. I can also take 5 pieces of mundane equipment. The issue that I have was because I made this model for something else. I didn't build him specifically for this ranger. I didn't equip him as efficiently as I could have. I can give him a bow and a quiver, and that's great. He's got light armor and a hand weapon. That's fine, but I have this 5th equipment slot that I could have taken, something like a shield, which would have given me +1 armor, which would have been great. Or instead of my hand weapon, I could have gotten a double-handed weapon and given me a lot greater damage potential. But I didn't take those things because, the model doesn't have them. Same with heavy armor, which might have been kind of a good idea. He's not equipped with heavy armor, so I didn't give him that. Now, I could have given him a rope, but he doesn't really have that on the model either, so I kind of passed that by. Plus, I don't see this guy climbing a whole lot. In the end, I gave him a dagger for his 5th piece of equipment. So he's got a backup weapon. If for some reason he loses his primary, I don't know that that's a thing that can happen, but maybe. What taking a dagger does do is that it doesn't take up an item slot. Now, if I had taken all 5 pieces of equipment and my spellbook, I believe that would have been all 6 item slots accounted for, and I wouldn't have been able to pick up any extra treasure, magic items, potions, that kind of thing that I might come across. And I would like to do that. So this setup, while I don't consider it to be ideal, I think it might be okay. So now let's go on to the companions. I've got 130, technically 132 recruitment points to spend, so I can get some pretty good ones. And the first thing I'm going to get is a Templar. I want someone who can pack a punch and also take a hit. I want a nice frontline tank type of fighter. My ranger I set up as a bit of a jack of all trades. He's going to be, just going where he needs to. So I want a dedicated close combat warrior. And so enter Grundel Gracht. Grundel Gracht is named after the villain from the old Doctor Who episode Androids of Tara. He is using the old metal Count's Champion model, the champion of the Greatsword unit in the Empire Army. I figured this was a guy that went along with Tyrus Halperdirk in his first adventure where he got lucky and got that big treasure score. So he probably rode that victory to a nice job as an elite guard inside the city. He's got his double-handed weapon, heavy armor, and the strength +4 skill. When you recruit a companion, you also get to add 3 to any other skill you want. I mean, it could be a skill that you already have, so I could bump his strength up to +7, which is kind of funny. But instead, I went for survival +3. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure why I chose that skill. Maybe I just pictured this guy as a survivor. Moving on, we have my tracker, Phillipe de Gaston. Now, when I went through the companion list, the tracker was the one that really spoke to me. Great stats, cool equipment, really handy tracking skill, kind of expensive at 30 recruitment points, but I thought that this is the guy that you really should have in a Rangers group. He's armed with a staff, bow, quiver, light armor, and if you're thinking of a model that has both a staff and a bow, as far as Warhammer models go, you're only thinking about one model, and that's Jean le Petit. In the old Bretonnian army, you had this special character, Bertrand le Brigand, a Robin Hood type that is kind of a unit upgrade for a group of archers, but you also got these other guys who are basically Friar Tuck and Little John in with there, and this is the Little John character. Anyway, just a fantastic model. I didn't own him at the time. I had to hunt him down on eBay, so I spent a little bit more than I'd like to, but whatever, worth it. For his extra 3 skill points, I just added them to his tracking skill, so he's like the world's best tracker. He's tracking +8. Means that Halperdirk doesn't have to scratch around in the dirt at all. This guy can do the job for him. So his name, Phillipe de Gaston, or Big Phil as we're probably going to call him mostly. At the time I thought Phillipe Gaston was the name of the villain in the movie Lady Hawk. I was wrong, it's actually Matthew Broderick's character, oops. More importantly, it uses the word Gaston, and of course he is the hunter villain from Beauty and the Beast. So I think that's pretty appropriate. Plus, as a Bretonnian model, it's fine that he has a French name. Next up, we have Patchy Jorvus. Again, a rogue is something that I thought was a great investment in. Cool stats, cool abilities. I'm not making a military unit here, I'm making basically an adventuring party. So I like having a guy with this. He's got a throwing knife, he's got a dagger, he comes with climb, perception, picklocks, traps, stealths, just all the skills you could want. And he's not very expensive either. He's not fantastic in a fight, but he's move 7. For his additional 3 skill points, I added those to his picklock. So his picklocks plus 8. So this guy's going to be my door opener. The model also is one of my all-time favorites. Johann the Knife, a dramatis personae from the Mordheim range. Again, if you're talking about a thief character from the Warhammer range, really this is the obvious choice. I actually have 2 of these guys. The first one I bought a long time ago at a reasonable price, but I used him in a conversion for a witch hunter. I don't regret that at all. The conversion turned out great, so I had to acquire this guy much later. I was actually going to use him as a thief hired sword for Mordheim. Never got around to that, but finally painting him up, he's going to be my rogue for Rangers of Shadowdeep. Patchy Jorvus is a combination name. It is an amalgam of Patchy and Sideburns Stabbington and Horace and Jasper. Patchy and Sideburns were the 2 thief thugs from the Disney Tangled movie, and Horace and Jasper were the 2 thieves from 101 Dalmatians. Anyway, this is the kind of lowlife that Tyrus Halperdirk has been hanging out with, carousing in the city's bars and such. Next up, we have a swordsman, Robert Renault. This model is using the human mercenaries kits, just parts from those. And I just really like the pose. This is one of my more successful free company, human mercenaries, that kind of thing that I got. I really like the duelist look and vibe that he's got going on. Swordsmen are cool in Rangers of Shadowdeep. They're not terribly cheap, but at a fight plus 4, they're probably going to win most of the fights they get themselves into. I gave him navigation plus 3 because no one else in my group had gotten navigation so far, so might as well. Perhaps he was a pirate before settling on a life of a duelist. The name Robert Renault is a play on Robert de Renault, who I believe is sometimes listed as the Sheriff of Nottingham. And finally, we have Kael Rexmaar, my man-at-arms. He is simply here to fill up points. 20 points, pretty cheap, hand weapon and shield, fight plus 3, he's fine. Just pulled one of my better models from the swordsman unit of my Empire force. He uses parts from both the old Empire Swordsman kit as well as the Human Mercenaries kit. I gave him Armory plus 3 as his skill, again, because no one else has it, and also because the name. Kael Rexmaar is a combination of 2 names. General Kael from Willow, leader of the Lockmar army, and Rexor, one of the chief thugs from the Conan the Barbarian movie. So perhaps he is studying the riddle of steel so that eventually he'll be able to make that awesome skull mask that General Kael had. And so there you have it. There's my group. Let me know if you have any questions, observations, concerns. You can put them in the comment section below. Again, I have everything squared away for the first mission, which consists of 2 scenarios, and I'll be playing that very soon. Hopefully I will see you there for that.